All right. Carry this. Total of lines 144, 145. Lesser of line 154, but there's nothing on for it. Oh, sorry. You know what it is. It's that time of year again, right? And I always put it off to the last minute. And this year I said it was going to be different, and I would do it ahead of time. But I've been so busy, and there's just been no time. And I thought, maybe now I would just. But fine. I'll put it off. We'll do it later. Talk to me the end of April. We'll see if I ever get there. But just doing this stuff has made me think, it's not just about accounting, is it? Because there's all kinds of moral issues connected to this doing your taxes thing. I mean, what if, for example, what if I have objections to some of the things that the government uses my money for? Say, what if I'm a pacifist? And I object to my tax money going to support a military. Or what if I have objections to some of the medical procedures that are covered by the healthcare system that I support? Or what if I object to how the government uses some of the tax money for partisan political purposes? There are all kinds of questions, aren't there? Taxation is, in fact, a moral minefield, which is precisely why one day a group of Herodians and Pharisees came up to Jesus to ask him questions about taxation. Now, they come up to him and they said this to him. Teacher, they said, we know that you are sincere and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. You understand what they were doing there, right? They were buttering him up. They were flattering him. They were trying to make him feel good about himself because they knew that what they were going to ask was a zinger of a question. A really tricky question. What they were really coming up to ask him was this: is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? That was the thorny moral question, legal question that they were asking. And it was a difficult question for a few reasons. It was difficult because the taxes they were talking about were taxes paid to Rome. And that is where those taxes essentially went, to Rome. In other words, they didn't see any benefit from those taxes. We're actually quite fortunate, of course. We get to pay taxes and actually see how they're used and see the benefit to us of the use of those taxes. So we get to drive on roads that are constructed by and maintained by the state. We get to make use of the healthcare system and other government programs that actually benefit us. They didn't have any of that. Everything that they paid was simply taken away and used to fill up the treasury in Rome. So they had those kinds of moral objections to the taxes. But there were also very thorny issues of Jewish law that made taxation even more objectionable to them. And Jesus understood that. And you can see how well Jesus understood that in the way that he responded to their question. Okay, so everyone knows what Jesus answered. In fact, Jesus' answer is probably one of the most famous sayings he ever said. So I'm going to ask you, what was Jesus' answer to that question? Can somebody tell me what was the answer? Render unto Caesar, or, in one we read today, give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's, right? Or, if you prefer, the King James Version, and who doesn't, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Everybody knows that answer, right? What if I were to tell you that that's not what Jesus said. Or at least that's not what Jesus said right away. Jesus gave a different answer. And let me demonstrate to you what Jesus actually said we're going to have to play this one out. I'm going to, Trent, ask me the question. Ask me the question that they asked you. Yeah, ask me that question. Okay. Give me a coin. Oh, come on. Give me a coin. Give me a coin. Oh, thank you. That's a lovely coin. That's beautiful and shiny and round and look at that. It's got a picture on it too. Say, whose picture is that? Queen, you say. She's got a coin in her purse and it's got a queen on it. Isn't that nice? Wow. That's how Jesus answered. Right? That's what he did. And that response of Jesus actually changes a great deal how you hear the rest of the exchange. What has Jesus just demonstrated by doing that? First of all, he's like Trent. He doesn't have a coin, right? He doesn't have any money. He has just demonstrated to the whole crowd that he does not have any money. And that immediately positions Jesus very differently in answering that question. Why? Because if he doesn't have any money, in fact, he has actually demonstrated that he's so unfamiliar with money, he doesn't even know what's on a coin. He has to ask them to tell him what's on a coin. Now, I mean, obviously, I got to assume Jesus hadn't lived that long without actually seeing a coin. He knew what was on a coin, but he was playing it up, right? He was pretending like he had never seen a coin before, because he was making a point. He didn't have any money to his name. Did Jesus therefore owe taxes? You can't tax people for what they don't have. Even the most tyrannical government in the world can't tax people who don't have anything. You can't get blood from a stone. So essentially, by asking for that coin, what Jesus is saying, okay, maybe you've got a problem here, maybe you've got an issue. I don't have an issue. I don't have a problem. I don't have any money. This is your problem. That's the first thing he's saying, right? But he's also making another much more important point by doing that. And understand how important that point is. You need to recognize who these people are who are asking Jesus this question. Gospel of Mark tells us that it was a group of people made up of two sorts that came up to Jesus and asked him that question. There were Herodians and there were Pharisees. Now the Herodians, essentially, were a political group. They were supporters of the ruling Herodian family in Judea. But the Pharisees, they were different. They were religious leaders. And what's more, they were religious leaders who were famous, who were honored for their commitment to follow the law of Moses, to follow it to the letter. That's what Pharisees were famous for. Jesus has just demonstrated to the whole crowd that these Pharisees have coins on them. Why is that important? Well, what was on that coin? Jesus made a point of making sure everyone knew what was on that coin. Asked them to describe it, right? And what was on that coin was engraved an image. Think about that for a moment. There was an image engraved on that coin. Seems to me, wasn't there some sort of obscure Jewish law, something about not having any graven images? Oh yeah, not obscure at all. In fact, one of the most important, one of the big 10. No graven images. Jesus has just demonstrated that these Pharisees are carrying around graven images, and not just any images. Because what would be the worst kind of image for a Jew to have? Well, that's easy. It would be the image of any god other than the God of Israel, right? So let's look at the coin again. On that coin, as he had them point out to everyone, was an image of Tiberius Caesar, the emperor. And above Tiberius Caesar's head, what's more, there was an inscription there written plainly for everyone to see, were the words, Tiberius Caesar, son of the god Augustus. And everyone knew what that meant as well. So not only are they carrying an image in their pockets, it is the image that is clearly labeled as a god. You understand what Jesus has done here? He hasn't even answered their question yet, and he's already beat them. He's already beat them at their own game. They came trying to show up to everyone how they understood so much more about the law and following it than he did. And he, with a simple question, a few simple questions, has demonstrated to the whole group that they don't know how to follow the law. That they are carrying around the image of the foreign god in their pockets. He's beat them already. Because this was a contest. It was meant to be a contest. He's already won. And he hasn't even answered the question yet. So finally, we get to Jesus' answer, the one that everyone knows, the one that we all remember. Give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, he says, and to God the things that are God's. He finally says this. He's already beaten his opponents, but he finally gives them a bit of advice. And what he essentially says with this is that there are two powers in this world. Two powers that would demand your allegiance and service. There is God and there is the emperor. And what he's saying is that if you are not in his position, if you actually own things, unlike him, you've got some choosing to do. What you're going to give to Caesar and what you're going to give to God. Now underneath this, of course, is the assumption Jesus is also saying, guys, you can avoid this whole problem. You don't have to deal with any of this. All you need to do is be just like me and not have anything. If you don't own anything, you don't have to sort anything out. And Jesus meant that literally. He intended for many of his disciples to follow his example. When one came up to him and said, what do I need to do? He said, take all your possessions, sell them, give the money to the poor. When you have nothing and can trust only God, then come and follow me. That was Jesus' ideal of discipleship. That's what he thought the best solution was. And indeed, there have been many Christians down through the ages who have followed that advice. St. Francis of Assisi followed that advice. And some really amazing things happened around him. So it's not impossible to follow that advice. But I personally do not count myself among those Christians who follow that advice. I've got stuff. I've got property. I have wealth. I expect you also have made the choice to live in this world and actually own stuff. And you know what? That's not a bad choice. That's a great choice. Obviously, we all know that. It's a good choice that can lead to so many good things that you can do with your wealth. Jesus isn't condemning you for having wealth, but he is saying it would be simpler if you didn't. Because if you do have wealth, you've got some sorting out to do. You got to figure out what belongs to God and what belongs to Caesar. say, well, how do you sort out this stuff? How do you look at your stuff and decide what is God's and what is Caesar's? But some of the sorting out is maybe not too hard for us to do. I mean, the first part, what you owe to Caesar, what you owe to the government, some of that is fairly obvious. I mean, for one thing, you do owe your taxes. You got stuff, you gotta pay taxes. And yes, we are very fortunate to be living in a society where we can actually see the benefit coming from our taxes. We can see the taxes we pay going to good and worthwhile things that support the public good. That's a privilege to live in a society like that. So yeah, we owe our taxes. We owe some other things to the government too. There are those, for example, who are called on to give their military service to the government, and where would we be without them? There are also those who choose to serve the government in the political field, and in the midst of the haze of party politics, try to do some good for the whole country. And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. And there are also those who serve in the civil service, who are teachers, who are caregivers in various ways. They are also giving something to the government. And I would suggest that to the extent that they are also serving the public good, they are also making a gift to God with that. So it's a little complicated, but for the most part, we can know what we owe the government. And as Christians, yes, we're called, with God's stuff, we're called faithfully to give that. So that part we can maybe figure out. But what about the rest? How do we figure out what among the rest belongs to God? For example, would it be good enough if we were to give a certain percentage to God? And that would take care of it, right? 10% is the traditional amount, the tithe that is called. Is that what we're supposed to do? Just chop off a certain percentage, give that to God, and everything's square? Now, the idea of giving a tithe, a certain percentage, is a biblical idea. It's mentioned several times in the Old Testament, sometimes as an example, sometimes as a law. But sometimes I don't think that that's what Jesus has in mind when he says this. At no point in any of his interactions with people does Jesus ask for people to give a certain percentage to God. As far as I can tell, nowhere in the early church did they ever ask for a certain percentage. I don't think that's what he means. Let's look at what he actually says. What Jesus is essentially saying is that you've got stuff, a certain portion of that belongs to God. But he doesn't say that there's 3 ways to divide that money, does he? He doesn't say, okay, you figure out, you do your taxes, you fill out the forms, you figure out what you owe the government, and then you figure out what you owe to God, and then you're done. And what it says is, there's only 2 options. You figure out what you owe the government, and the rest, all of it belongs to God. All of it. Now, God lets you keep it. God lets you use it. But God never relinquishes your claim over that remaining portion. It's all his. God leaves it in your care, and leaves it in your care as a steward, as a manager. God expects you to use it, for example, to care for your family, to take care, to participate in the economy, which leads to good for all kinds of people. But God never relinquishes his claim on it. God expects you to use it to meet your own needs, even to meet your pleasures. There's nothing wrong with that. But God expects you to be accountable for that and how you use it. stuff. And then you got to figure out what good is easier. The rest belongs to God. Or you can have no stuff, like him, and then everything you are, everything you have belongs to God. Either way, though, it belongs to God. The challenge is what we do with what we owe to God. God gives it to you as a gift. God doesn't attach any strings to the stuff you have. But God has great expectations for what you're going to do. Take a few moments in silence.